So what I wanted to start with was to go back to this idea of atavism, and especially because, Katrina, when I was listening to you, the music that you played for us, I mean, I don't really totally understand how these things work, so perhaps I'm wrong, but there's like an interesting way in which there's these layers that are building upon one another. And then I was thinking about your archaeological practice, and obviously also thinking about the kinds of interventions, political interventions that Marsham and Daniel, you guys are doing in relationship to an additive process like 3D printing, and also even the kind of additive thought that you're putting into something like the manifesto, where there's this interesting way in which all of you are kind of playing with ideas that you both disagree with and agree with, and putting it forward as a kind of manifesto. So I wanted to start there in terms of thinking about what does this notion of additivism, or the kind of the possibilities of building up.
Yeah, additivism. Wow, that's a big question. I think there's something inherent in the very notion of what it is to act. And I think that this comes very much back to, again, the figure of Haraway, who's been floating around for the past couple of days. But it's definitely something Katrina said about situated knowledge. And when we think of this as an embodied act to reposition ourselves in our bodies in this particular space and time, to be aware of what it is to be a human, to be aware of what it is to be a white man, to be aware of what it is to be whatever that is. I think that in a kind of post-human sense, that situatedness needs to become much more rooted in very much in materialities, and maybe again in kind of what Katrina's talking about in terms of forms of space and thought and new ways of distributing that. And so additivism for us becomes a very kind of material way of thinking through that, but also a metaphoric way of thinking through that. Not only to rethink the history and the being of the planet as something which is about these kind of minute accretions that build to enormous consequences that span material, spaces, times, but also about then what it is to act as humans, as situated beings within that space, and what it is to enact small gestures that can build to some consequence. And we very much naturally fall back on the rhetoric of trying to solve the problem, trying to come up with solutions. And that solution, that solving, immediately needs to be reintegrated into another situation. We need to rethink what it is to solve. Who are we solving for? What are we solving for? What is the outcome? So if additivism can somehow have a neutral quality to it, to be, I don't know, to be removed from its humanness, then I think it can be useful beyond just thinking about 3D printing.
I'm just going to have my own microphone and interrupt you. Go for it. Yeah, I mean, I actually think about it more as not having a solution and that being okay. You know, talking about that responsibility, I think that is the most important thing. I think it's okay to propose only questions and not have a solution, and think about that as an additive process where, you know, I said at the beginning of my talk that it's been really important working on this project, any project that I've worked on that is like research-based, and just allowing for things to be interrupted and redefined. And part of that, being able to do that partly also with building a community that will become part of this defining and redefining and rethinking and finding those points of conflicts. And also not having a binary thinking about all these relationships. That has been a really important aspect of additivism in general, manifestos, that you have a lot of conflicting points, and that should be okay. So I think that has, in our process, has had a really important role, but also I see it from where you were coming to it as well. So.
Yes. Oh, it's okay. I have.
You have everyone has a microphone.
I agree with this. Well, the fact that process is an inevitable part of a system that is undergoing change, that has different points of evolutionary development. And so where things fail, I think is really interesting. And actually, I think failure needs to be an integral part of the system, and whatever system you're working with or trying to create. Because failure is, rather than being something that that holds you back or that you attach to, it's liberating. So every sort of point of failure is where you can, one, identify your contingencies, because this will show the sort of different perspectives that you have, that you're operating with. And two, it means that there's never a retirement from production, as you can continually identify the blind spots, for instance, where failure actually began. But I think what I wanted to say a little bit more about was the aspect of fictionalizing, creating fictions, and also hyperstitioning communities and different social platforms for thinking collectively. Especially because if we are to bring the abstract to the concrete, or go the most abstract to the concrete in the Hegelian sense, we need this kind of social consciousness to integrate ideas in new formations. And because we need these spaces to actually go, otherwise it wouldn't, I could go really far into these erotic metaphysics and these erotic practices with other people. But if there's no sort of social ecology to support this, then the system collapses. So you have to invent spaces where it's possible and communities where it's possible. And then that way you can create the sort of global to local transits that we're talking about. And it doesn't remain myopic, instantiated in the local, because it's continually about sort of breaking the boundaries that it's setting for itself in order to do its hypothesis testing and research and fictionalizing. And making music is an interesting way for fictionalizing, because you can really get into this abstract space that also brings other people into it through bodies and rhythms and vibrations. Yes.
Can I also add this? You were talking about the collective conscious, and I think another thing is collective imagination, and kind of maybe moving also from fiction to science fiction, which to me, like for a lot of work that I've been working on, and also with additivism, that is a very important space to enter, because it's kind of this idea of beyond imagination, allowing ourselves to really rethink everything we are, right? And kind of these, like, other than human, more than human, this, you said this word, I forgot, it's called like the
otherwise than being, or
yes.
Being otherwise.
Being otherwise, yes. I think that is also a place to enter as this collective imagination act, which is very important.
I would go back to Heather's talk in terms of toxicity, but also connecting to Katrina in this notion of eroticism. I was thinking very much about horror and science fiction horror as a kind of an erotics of the material that is beyond the human. To not consider it to be a threat. I mean, the word monster comes from the monstrum, which is to reveal, to show. And what is being revealed, what is being shown through the horror is what truly is the scary thing. And that's what we need to embrace, not that the horror is a threat, the horror of these toxic materialities, these emerging amorphous beings, but actually to embrace that as the thing which we have already always been and always will be. And that becomes, for us, a form of action. And it's a quote that I didn't read out, but it's Rosie Braidotti claims that science fiction horror is a great expression of our contemporary times because of its amorphous capacity, its monstrous capacity to change and be fluid. That way of being able to change and be fluid and denounce your humanness is what we need today in new forms of action. We need to enact horror as a way of acting and being. And this is hyperstition. This is not, but it's not hyperstition. it's real. You know, it's absolutely 100% necessary. Yeah.
Yeah, I just actually had the privilege of hanging out with Rosie Braidotti for a couple days before I came here, and so obviously she's on my mind, and certainly her notion, her distinguishment between bios and Zoe, where bios is the life force that is animating the human, but Zoe is a life force that animates everything, and her emphasis on Zoe as an incredibly important feminist concept, I think, in a really interesting ways is coming through in all of your work in terms of thinking about what does it mean. And she's also a big fan of refusing humanism. She very much is open about the fact that she's an anti-humanist, and meaning that in the sense of really thinking through what the project of being human actually was about, which for the most part was actually about the exclusion of most humans from that category. So and then by way of understanding that many of us, most of us, were never entered into that category, or only very provisionally in the first place, perhaps is not even a category that's worth really sort of reinvesting in. And the ways in which you're talking about the kind of collectivity of the human as both an organism and as a social creature, I think really resonates with that. One thing I wanted to go back to was these kinds of processes of collectivity and collaboration. I mean, all of you work, all of you have individual practices, but also practices with other people. And then you're all working at these kinds of really interesting intersections of a kind of like open source thought. So, and creating platforms for other people to be able to contribute. So I don't know if you want to say something more about what that means for your work.
Well, I can definitely say for the xenofeminist collective or hybrid identity, Laboria Cubonics, the sort of open source platform and the sort of mimetic evolution that it has undertaken since we first posted the manifesto, and even prior to that there was some kind of hype that was created. What is so important about having a hybrid identity and having it open source is that you allow for both diffraction and integration. And you can think of diffraction in the way that Karen Barad speaks of the sort of diffraction of particles or diffraction of ideas and positions. And so even though, for instance, in the collective itself, we might not agree on certain positions, that is actually what makes the project so integrative, is when you don't agree, because then you see all the sort of negative spaces between. And so in a very general sense, this is it's a privilege to work this way, because you can really think together when you have this negative space. As in, it means that you can propose more points to question, and so you're constantly in tension with the work you're doing. With music, and I want to speak about improvisation, because I do a lot of improvisation with the computer, which is maybe strange, but that's kind of how I got into music. Was, well, not into music, but when I fell out of music, I went into improvisation. And when I got back into music, I went through improvisation. And so I started improvising with the computer. And when improvising with the computer, you're improvising with sound. And it becomes these sort of different entities that you're, there is no more human. It's like speaking as no one in this sense.
I wanted to sort of as well talk a little bit about how xenofeminism and our project kind of linked, and I think that does speak to this notion of collaboration, because one of the things that was exciting for us was we worked on this manifesto, and it was a long process, and we released it, and it was literally 4 or 5 weeks later that the Xenofeminist Manifesto came out. And that was hugely exciting because there were so many resonances, and we'd obviously both groups separately had been thinking about some of the ideas of accelerationism and kind of like some of these things, but we're also we had like a lot of problems, and we wanted to gesture to this. So, and this comes back to how, as well, our work has been received, I think. One of the most amazing things for me, and I think for both of us, has been to talk to students working at universities who, perhaps in the arts, perhaps in design, and they're learning new processes all the time, and they go to these tech labs where it's like, today we're going to learn how to use a 3D printer, and they sit at the back and they have an incredibly dry technical run through of the processes of using this technology. And they would sit, and I mean, I've had people say this to me where they say, I sat there, it didn't interest me, and I forgot about it. But as soon as I saw your manifesto, I knew that there was a politics embedded in this technology that overlapped with my ideas and with my work, whether it's feminist discourse, whatever it is. And so for us, that's a form of collaboration which exists before us and it exists after us. These ideas are out there. These ideas are already in people's minds. There's young practitioners who are trying to express and trying to act in new ways. And then for them to come upon these languages like xenofeminism, like additivism, hopefully it immediately instills them in the sense that there is a collective consciousness that is emerging already. And that's hugely exciting. I mean, maybe you want to say something.
I kind of want to also talk about the cookbook, which is going to be, it's going to be a selection of, critical essays and science fiction, and then different instructions and blueprints. And it's really exciting to, when we had the call and we were receiving all these submissions, there's so many things we didn't even think about or consider. And as our project was growing, it went from 3D printing to like a larger way of thinking about additive, both as metaphoric, but also additive processes as not just 3D printing. And that also kind of seeing that grow and around us, and we growing with it and letting people also define it with us. I think that has been the most exciting things to witness. And who knows where we will be in 1 year with this project, but I'm really excited to experience and just
the crapularity will be sucked into it.
Yeah,
totally.
yeah.
Maybe we should open.
Yeah, that's what I was about to suggest. Does anybody have any questions for any of us? For us together?
Thank you. I'd like to ask Katrina, towards the end you mentioned something about elevating consciousness. At the same time, we're all using a lot of hybrid terms, which point to the past and to kind of possible future. I would refer to David Rodin's thesis on discontinuity, which, when there is a post-human intelligence, it's going to be so different that we cannot even imagine or even talk or even point to it right now.
Yes.
So, if you could respond to that, please. Consciousness, from this point of view, if we don't know what it will become.
Can I try an answer?
The point of view of flux.
Well, if you don't mind, I'll try, and then maybe we can try together, actually. It's a very good question. I don't want to be too utopic in my answer, which could happen when talking about consciousness elevating. So we should be pragmatic here. I don't know, this question of machines is really interesting and really complicated, because there's obviously different levels of intelligence that, the further we go into artificial general intelligence, you get into this sort of super intelligence. And this is beyond our capacity to even think. So of course, it's a huge discontinuity for human thought. And rather than thinking, I would love to think there, that's great, and we should try. But that's the realm of mathematics, and so we will try to think there as much as possible. But I think what's really interesting about the question of machines in relation to what some of the things were brought up today is to relate it to the Anthropocene and to Zoe, would be how we can actually, maybe this elevation of consciousness should begin with actually going back to the first relationship between technology and nature that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals had, which is a very primitive relationship. But I say primitive only as something, it's before, I mean, it's in the past, it's marked at a certain point in the past. So it's an early development, early technology, you know, you don't have these complex machines. But the sort of very roots for thinking the way in which there could be no differentiation between nature and machine are there. And perhaps in this sort of future point in time, there will also be no differentiation between nature and machine. So we kind of come back again. And so I think we should start elevating consciousness to start thinking technology as natural. So we can also technologize nature in a sense. So we see that they are synthetic. And for instance, someone's work that is really interesting to me is Dr. Rachel Armstrong. She does work on redesigning the environment with nature, and also trying to think of ways of inhabiting in space with plants and different projects like this. So these are sort of practical engagements with the material, but it's this kind of flip understanding of nature and technology, not as divided, but you sort of continua of each other, especially if you think of it in terms of chemicals, you know, then the possibilities are endless for actually maybe elevating consciousness pragmatically with technology. You know, it's not just abstract. It's also, it should be very practical.
I would like to answer by thinking about the different kind of, I don't know if I call them schools, but the word post-human in itself has a lot of resonances and has been used in a lot of different ways. David Roden, his brand would be maybe speculative posthumanism, where he is speculating on the possibility of beings that perhaps are beyond our capacity to even understand what they would be. And related to that is a term which is critical posthumanism, which was coined by Jill Didder and was popularized by Neil Badminton. And I essentially, I'm very much simplifying here, but the critical posthuman position is, the question is, can we think of other ways of being, other ways of thinking beyond ourselves? The answer is no. No, we can't. We're human. Everything will always collapse back onto the humanness. And in terms of what Katrina is talking about in terms of AI, or what we're talking about in terms of how do we act in ways to promote these futures without then collapsing them back into our very humanness again, the answer is weird. The answer is queering. The answer is the outside. The answer is contradiction. I think that there's a great paper by Benjamin Bratton. He gave it at Transmediale last year, and then it was turned into a short piece for the New York Times blog, I think. And in that, he questions how we are positing the artificial intelligences that we are creating now, and how we integrate them into our society, and the benefit that they have to us. He argues that those artificial intelligences should be made as non-human as possible, that they should be, we should come up with ways to create AIs that do not reflect back on what we want and what we perceive, because we've fucked things up, and we will continue to do so, and we'll continue to control things dependent on our norms wherever we are situated. And maybe it's time that the machines do go off on their own. Maybe it's time that those tentacles from the bottom of the ocean are allowed to rise up and have their wicked way with us, because we're not going to be able to solve it, and we're not going to have any influence on what comes after us, and that's a good thing.
I think that's an amazing place to end. It'd be lovely to continue this conversation, but we're out of time, and the non-human will now take over.